They said Japan surrendered, that the emperor's voice, cracking through the static on August 15th, 1945, ended the most brutal war Asia had ever seen. But what if that surrender was only the beginning of another war? One that was never declared, never documented, and never meant to be known. For most of the world, the image of Japan's defeat is clear. American bombers, mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a nation on its knees. But in the shadows of the ruins, something else was happening. Something that didn't fit the story the victors wrote. While the world celebrated peace, a quiet network of men, generals, spies, and scientists, began to vanish. Entire units of the Imperial Army were wiped from records. Thousands of tons of documents were burned. And under the guise of occupation and reconstruction, Japan's shadow government was being born. The Americans called it Operation Black Umbrella, though officially it never existed. Its mission, to secure every remnant of Japan's wartime intelligence before the Soviets could reach it. Its consequence, the silent survival of an empire that was never meant to die. When General MacArthur's forces landed in Tokyo, they believed they were dismantling an enemy. But in truth, they were inheriting a machine. The Imperial Japanese Army had built vast intelligence networks across Asia, from Manchuria to Burma, feeding on science, ideology, and terror. These were not mere soldiers. They were architects of power. Men like General Ishishiro, mastermind of Unit 731, who turned human lives into weapons. Officially, he was hanged. In reality, he was recruited. U.S. intelligence struck a secret bargain. In exchange for their research on biological warfare, dozens of Japanese scientists and officers were granted immunity. It was the same deal America gave the Nazis under Operation Paperclip. Only this time, the experiments were far darker, and the secrecy even tighter. By 1947, these men were quietly installed into Japan's new, peaceful institutions. Research centers, government ministries, corporate boards. They would never again wear the imperial uniform, but they would serve the same emperor from behind a different curtain. Then came the strangest part. The emperor himself, Hirohito, was spared from war crimes. To the Japanese people, it was mercy. To historians, it was strategy. Documents later declassified hinted that MacArthur's administration viewed the emperor not as a war criminal, but as a tool of control. By keeping him on the throne, America could pacify a shattered nation and reshape it in its own image. But for those still loyal to the old empire, it was a sign that the emperor's divine right had survived, and with it, the dream of a future resurrection. In the shadows of post-war Tokyo, whispers spread among ex-soldiers and loyalists. The emperor never died. The Tsi Empire never ended. What began as scattered cells of fanatics slowly evolved into something else, a covert brotherhood, former officers disguised as businessmen, monks, and bureaucrats. Their goal, to preserve Japan's spirit until the day it could rise again. By 1950, Japan's official war machine was gone, but beneath the new democracy, another machine was forming, one fueled not by nationalism, but by silence. Across the Pacific, the Korean War erupted. America, desperate for allies, began to rearm Japan in secret. Factories once making tanks now produced civilian machinery. Military engineers were rebranded as industrial planners. And under the code name Project Phoenix, Japan's forbidden industries were slowly reborn. But there was a price. Those who knew too much, journalists, whistleblowers, even former soldiers, began disappearing. Some turned up dead, their deaths ruled as suicides. Others simply vanished. One man, a U.S. intelligence officer stationed in Yokohama, wrote in a classified memo before his disappearance, "The Emperor's men are still here. They wear suits now, but their loyalty hasn't changed. They are waiting." By the early 1950s, Japan had become the perfect illusion. A peaceful democracy on the surface, and a silent empire beneath it. Its economy surged, its people rebuilt, and the world moved on. But those who looked deeper saw the same symbols re-emerging, the same faces in power, the same oaths whispered in secrecy. And somewhere, deep within the imperial palace, the old rituals continued. The emperor would bow before an altar no foreigner had ever seen. The same place where, according to legend, the spirits of Japan's fallen warlords still gathered. The world thought the war had ended, but for those who still served the emperor in silence, it had only changed its name. By the time Japan had signed its peace treaties and rejoined the free world, the seeds of something far older had already taken root. They called it reconstruction. But those who truly knew what was happening whispered another name: the Resurrection Network. It began quietly, buried inside the new economic miracle. To the west, Japan was rebuilding under American guidance, rising from the ashes of defeat. But in the boardrooms of Tokyo and Osaka, a different war was being fought. Not with guns, but with influence. Men who once commanded divisions in Manchuria or Burma now chaired steel companies, banks, and shipping firms. They were no longer generals. They were patriotic businessmen. And behind every corporation that rose from nothing, there was a file. Stamped, confidential, marked former imperial asset. The Americans thought they were creating a loyal ally. In truth, they were financing the rebirth of the same empire they had sworn to destroy. The U.S. Occupation Authority called it economic stabilization. The Japanese called it keiretsu, a network of powerful industrial families bound by blood, loyalty, and silence. But deep inside that web were older bonds, forged in the last days of the war, secret oaths of protection, survival, and vengeance. As Japan's economy boomed, the Resurrection Network grew stronger. Money flowed through front companies, research grants, and foreign contracts, all appearing legitimate. But hidden within these structures were ghost accounts, funneling millions into covert projects, labeled only as defense research. One such project, uncovered decades later, was Facility 9, officially a civilian weather station built near Mount Fuji. Unofficially, it housed remnants of Japan's wartime research division, continuing experiments once conducted by Unit 731. The Americans monitored it, but never intervened. Perhaps because some of their own agents were inside it. Declassified reports from the CIA's Tokyo office describe a secret pact made in 1952, a handshake between former imperial officers and U.S. intelligence operatives. The goal: to use Japan's rising economy as a front for anti-communist operations across Asia. In exchange, Washington agreed to overlook the darker elements of Japan's past. The pact had one key architect, Yoshio Kodama, a war criminal turned fixer. Before 1945, Kodama was a black market kingpin tied to the Imperial Navy. After the war, he became one of the richest men in Japan, the silent bridge between old loyalists and new politicians. He funded campaigns, manipulated unions, and brokered deals between the CIA and Japan's hidden power brokers. He called himself a patriot. Others called him the emperor's banker. Meanwhile, within Japan's new government, a quiet purification began. Files on war crimes were destroyed. Witnesses disappeared. Even the narrative taught to schoolchildren changed. The empire's crimes softened, its soldiers rebranded as defenders. The truth wasn't erased. It was rewritten. By the mid-1950s, Japan's intelligence community had been fully restructured, officially under U.S. oversight. But many of its officers were the same men who once ran the Kempeitai, Japan's feared military police. Their new agency, the Public Security Intelligence Bureau, shared information with the CIA by day and guarded Japan's internal secrets by night. And beneath them, the old Emperor's Guard, the Tokeitai, quietly regrouped under the guise of a Veterans Association. Officially ceremonial, unofficially a network of thousands. A document found years later, labeled Echo Protocol, described the network's long-term objective: preserve the spirit of the empire until the world changes. Rebuild strength not through weapons, but through control of knowledge, industry, and memory. That was their true war. Not conquest of land, but conquest of perception. And they were winning. The same philosophy soon bled into Japan's corporations, universities, and media. Scholars sympathetic to the old regime quietly shaped historical narratives. Textbooks omitted atrocities, and patriotic films began to paint Japan's wartime past as tragic, not criminal. A nation once conquered was learning to see itself again as a victim, and slowly the world began to agree. In 1960, a mysterious explosion ripped through a small research site outside Nagano. The official cause, a gas leak. But witnesses described military trucks sealing off the area before the fire even started. Among the debris, U.S. analysts later identified remnants of lab equipment linked to wartime bioweapon research. The facility's director vanished. 2 weeks later, his body was found near the coast. The autopsy ruled drowning. The file was sealed under national security. A confidential report to the Pentagon noted, Japan remains outwardly compliant, but inwardly autonomous. The old guard has adapted. They do not need armies anymore. By the end of the 1960s, Japan was hailed as the world's greatest recovery story. Peaceful, industrious, and loyal to the West. But in the halls of power, the same names from 1945 still echoed. The same ministries, the same families, the same emperor, older, quieter, untouched. And in the shadows of Tokyo, a single phrase began to appear scrawled in coded messages and intercepted transmissions. The chrysanthemum sleeps, but never dies. The meaning was clear. The network lived. And the war, the secret war, was far from over. By the dawn of the 1970s, Japan's cities glittered with neon and steel. To the outside world, it was a miracle. A nation that had risen from the ashes of war to become an economic superpower. But beneath that illusion of peace and progress lay something far older, far colder. The silent heartbeat of the resurrection network. The empire had found a new weapon. Not rifles, not bombers, but commerce. Factories that once forged tanks now built radios, engines, and microchips. Cargo ships sailed not under a flag of war, but under the banner of trade. And behind those corporations, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Nippon, sat the same bloodlines that had funded the Imperial Army a generation earlier. The warlords had traded uniforms for suits, but their loyalty was unchanged. They called it Keizai Senso, the economic war. America celebrated Japan's rise. To Washington, it proved capitalism had triumphed over fascism and communism alike. But a few analysts inside the Pentagon saw something else. A familiar pattern. The same centralized hierarchy. The same unquestioning devotion to authority. The same myth of national destiny. One report, written in 1972 by a senior intelligence officer, warned, Japan's economic expansion is not merely market-driven. It follows the same strategic logic as military conquest: incremental, precise, and total. He was ignored. By then, Japan had already become the third largest economy in the world. Its corporations began buying foreign assets, ports, even mines, not as investors, but as inheritors. Each deal, each acquisition, was a step toward something more profound, an empire reborn through trade. But Japan's rise wasn't entirely organic. In secret, the Resurrection Network had been building alliances far beyond Asia. Through shell companies and silent partners, they extended influence across Southeast Asia, Latin America, and even Africa. Regions once under European control, but now ripe for economic domination. The CIA called it the Pacific Mirage. To the world, it looked like prosperity. In truth, it was occupation by proxy. Japanese corporations funneled funds into construction projects, mines, and ports in exchange for exclusive rights, controlling supply chains the way the old empire once controlled colonies. Where soldiers once marched, contracts now dictated allegiance. And quietly, within those contracts, were clauses written in archaic legal Japanese, references to sovereign partnership and imperial continuity. Few ever translated them. But not everyone was blind. A small group of journalists and academics began to question Japan's miraculous rise. Among them was an American researcher named Dr. Alan Reeves, who published a book in 1976 titled The Empire That Never Fell. He argued that Japan's recovery was not reconstruction. It was continuation. That beneath the surface of democracy and diplomacy, an ancient machinery of control still operated. 2 weeks after the book's release, Dr. Reeves disappeared from his Tokyo hotel. His body was never found. Japanese authorities called it a tourist accident. The U.S. Embassy called it a tragedy. But the classified memo sent from the CIA's Far East Division told another story. Subject Reeves likely neutralized by domestic actors tied to industrial networks. High-level coordination observed. Recommend case be closed. Throughout the 1980s, the mirage deepened. Japan's dominance in electronics, automobiles, and banking reshaped global power. But within its borders, silence reigned. No politician dared question the Keiretsu families. No journalist dared link them to wartime figures. And those who tried were buried under lawsuits, ruined reputations, or sudden accidents. Meanwhile, the emperor remained a spectral figure, unseen, untouched, yet omnipresent. When Emperor Hirohito finally died in 1989, the world mourned him as a symbol of peace. But in Japan, within the private shrines of the old guard, a different ritual took place. They called it the continuance ceremony, a closed-door gathering of business magnates, generals, and priests. No outsiders were allowed. No cameras recorded it, but one document later surfaced from an anonymous whistleblower. A transcript of a single line, recited by an elderly industrialist. The emperor does not die. He merely changes form. That night, the whispers returned. The chrysanthemum sleeps, but never dies. In the 1990s, Japan's economy began to falter, the so-called lost decade. To most economists, it was a financial collapse. But to the inner circle of the Resurrection Network, it was a planned retreat. A strategic withdrawal to consolidate power, erase traces, and shift influence to new fronts: technology, finance, and information. And they had a new frontier in mind: globalization. By embedding their industries into every major Western supply chain, Japan ensured that its downfall would be the world's downfall. Dependency became deterrence. It was the same principle that had once guided its armies. Make the enemy rely on you, and you will never be defeated. But somewhere, buried deep in a vault beneath Tokyo, was something darker. A classified dossier marked Project Amaterasu. It described a long-term initiative, a plan to maintain cultural and ideological dominance through media, education, and digital systems. If the 20th century was about territory, this new war would be about minds. The emperor's legacy would no longer be carried by armies or industries, but by the stories people told, the symbols they wore, the technology they used. The empire had learned to live inside the modern world. Invisible, indestructible, eternal. Tokyo, 1972. A young Japanese reporter named Katsuji Tanaka disappears after publishing a story claiming to possess photographs of Hirohito's secret wartime council. Dated 1948, 3 years after Japan's surrender. His typewriter was found still running. The paper jammed mid-sentence. It read, "The emperor never abdicated, only changed his uniform." That single line would become a forbidden echo in post-war Japan, whispered by journalists, dismissed by historians, yet kept alive by intelligence officers who had seen too much. Because by the 1970s, Japan had become an economic superpower, rebuilt from ashes with American aid. But beneath that prosperity lay the silent machinery of an old empire, operating under new names. Industrial conglomerates that had fueled Japan's war machine, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Nippon Steel, were back, running the country's future. And the bureaucrats guiding them, many were the same men who once planned conquests in Manchuria and Southeast Asia. The war had ended, but the system survived. The emperor, shielded by myth, remained the center of a new kind of empire, one built not on soldiers, but on corporations, secrecy, and obedience. In declassified U.S. intelligence files from the late 1940s, there's mention of Operation Chrysanthemum, a covert policy allowing former imperial officers to rejoin Japan's defense ministries under new titles, civilian advisors, liaison specialists, economic consultants. Many of them had ties to Unit 731, the Biological Warfare Division, whose crimes were erased in exchange for data shared with the U.S. military. The Allies called it pragmatic. History calls it betrayal. By the 1980s, whispers spread again. A group of researchers discovered that Japan's Ministry of Health was still funding projects linked to Unit 731 veterans under the name Biomedical Advancement. When the documents surfaced, they vanished within weeks. The witnesses silenced, the files, marked top secret, destroyed by order. And in that silence, Japan's post-war illusion held. The emperor remained untouchable, the nation obedient, the truth buried beneath Tokyo's neon glow. Even today, in the imperial archives, there's a sealed folder marked simply 1945, Continuity. No historian has been allowed to open it, but those who've seen its title whisper one thing, that the empire didn't fall in 1945. It merely went underground. The soldiers were replaced by businessmen, the weapons by trade, and the war by silence. Because sometimes the most powerful empires don't die. They just learn how to disappear.